right, I'm going to be doing Unit 1, Chapter 1, and I'm going to be doing a quick review for my students here to make their lives a little bit easier. All right, I'm starting off the beginning of the chapter here, where we meet the people that are going to be important in this lesson. So we begin with Henry Clay. Here's Henry Clay right over here. He's going to be important later on when we talk about the Great Compromise, because he's going to be the person that's going to be in charge of the Missouri Compromise in 1820, which is going to help kind of hold off the Civil War. He's also going to be important in the Compromise of 1850 with California, and we'll be discussing that a little bit later. Robert E. Lee is our next person over here. What's important about Robert E. Lee is that he is going to turn down Lincoln's offer to be commander of the Union forces and actually going to be the commander of the Confederate forces in the South. Of course, we have Jefferson Davis. Jefferson Davis, the most important thing about Jefferson Davis is that he is going to be president of the new Confederacy in the South. Then we have Lincoln. Of course, we all know Lincoln. He was president of the United States at the beginning of the Civil War. And in fact, one of the reasons we had the Civil War was because of really his election in a way, because the South knew that he was against slavery, and they decided they better secede before he makes it a national law that slavery is illegal. Also, he is the one that's going to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, which stated that all slaves in the South would be free, but not all slaves in the United States. I just want to make that clear. Joseph Sinclair, he was important because they took over the slave ship, and that was the slave ship Amistad. It ended up going, they sailed the ship, ended up going to the north. They wanted their freedom, went all the way to the Supreme Court, and they ruled that all the people on that slave ship would be sent back to Africa, so they got their freedom. Of course, we all know Harriet Tubman. We're not quite sure when she was born. That's why it says about 1820. Up over here it says about 1820. But we do know she's a very brave woman. Even after she escaped, she made 19 trips right here back down to the South. We know she freed over 300 slaves, and not one of her slaves ever got caught. Clara Barton is important because she was a volunteer nurse during the war, and she's going to be the founder of the American Red Cross, which we still have today, which is an international organization to help people all around the world. And of course, Ulysses S. Grant, he's going to be important in our discussion. He is going to be the commander of the Union armies by Lincoln. And later on, he is going to become President of the United States. All right, our chapter begins by introducing one of the big causes of the Civil War, which was sectionalism. Now, we have to take why was there sectionalism. So it's really talking about the United States at this point being divided up into two regions, the North and the South. Now, it says at the very beginning of our chapter that they were very different geographically. Okay, they're talking about the lay of the land, mountains, weather, those types of things, how they were so different. And that's going to lead to a different way of life. This was during the Industrial Revolution, which means industry is becoming much more important for everybody's way of life, which means more factories. So we're going to find out the different lifestyles. For the test, you have to know that Southerners lived a mostly rural way of life, which means most of them lived on farms and small towns. Okay, they did have a couple of cities, but very few of them were very big. In fact, 9 out of the 10 largest cities were in the north during this time. Northerners, on the other hand, many of them lived an urban way of life, which means they lived a city way of life. Okay, although most of them, they still lived on farms. More and more people were working in factories. And since they were working in factories, they were making a living, and their viewpoint towards slavery is going to be different because slavery was not important to the South. Okay. Now, of course, the goal of factory workers and owners in the North were going to be different than the um, goals of the people in the South, and this is going to lead to a disagreement. Okay. In 1846, Congress is going to pass a law that lowered the tariffs of the United States charged for goods, imported goods. Okay. Now, a tariff is a tax, and the purpose of a tariff was to protect American businesses from foreign businesses shipping cheaper products to the United States. Now, of course, this lowering of the tariff is going to make Northerners very angry because that's going to make things from Europe, especially England, cheaper for Southerners to buy. Of course, they don't like that, so the Northerners, what do they want? They wanted higher tariffs on these imported goods. Okay? And that would encourage the Southerners to buy it. Southerners, on the other hand, wanted lower tariffs. Why? They wanted to buy cheaper goods that were made in Great Britain. So all of these differences are going to lead to what we call sectionalism. And you have to know for the test that sectionalism is loyalty to your part of the country. In other words, you felt more like a Texan, more like a Georgian, more like a Mississippian than you did as an American as a whole. Okay. On all tests, it's very important that we look at the graphs and the charts that they give us. Okay. Now, what's a little bit misleading about these charts right here is that these are percentages. So percentages can be misleading because we don't know how many people we're talking about. So we have to kind of look at both of these together to get an idea. We'll look at these pie charts, and we're going to look at this graph right here. We look at the population in the South, where people living in rural areas here in the blue versus in cities, and we see there's a great disparity here. More than 6,300,000 almost, compared to only 300, a little bit, less than 400,000 people living in cities. And then we look at the North. In the North, they had like over 3 million people living in cities. And yes, they did have a lot of people still living an urban, a rural way of life. But still, when we look at this as a whole, we could see that there were a lot more city dwellers in the North, which means a lot more people working in factories and a lot more products being made in the North. Okay, now we're going to look at why was slavery so important in the South. We already know that they lived mostly a rural way of life. Okay, they didn't have many factories, and farming was very important. So for the South and these large plantations, they needed a lot of cheap labor, hence slaves. They grew cotton, tobacco, and rice down in the South. And although in 1850 most northern states had outlawed slavery because Northerners worked in factories and they were paid for their work, that was their viewpoint. And they also believed that nobody should own another person. Slavery was just too profitable. It tells us right here that the cost of owning a slave, that they would make at least twice as much money as the cost of owning a slave. So for every $100 you spent, you got $200 back, so that was very profitable. So they didn't want to give that advantage up. Okay. Most of the slaves worked on cotton fields. These were these large plantations. And by 1860, there were almost 4 million people in the South that were African American. Okay? And in a lot of the states, they even outnumbered the whites that were there. If we look at the graph down here, we could see that the free Africans in the United States, and of course the ones that are growing most likely are going to be in the North, we're not going up very much. However, if we look through here and we look at this graph, we can see over time, over 10, 20, 30, 40 years, the drastic increase in the number of slaves. Now, one of the reasons for this drastic increase in the number of slaves was the invention of the cotton gin. Now, taking the seeds out of the cotton is very, very difficult, but unfortunately, the invention of the cotton gin made it much, much quicker to take the seeds out of the cotton, And from that point on, the slave trade is going to increase, and the number of slaves are going to increase because of that. So here's a typical farm down here where you can see that you'd have some people watching over the slaves as they worked to make sure that they were not trying to work slowly.